When the Galactic Council banned kinetic weapons, they thought they had finally declawed humanity. They called our railguns barbaric and forced us to disarm. But they forgot one crucial detail. Humans didn't use kinetics because they were our only option. We used them because they were the most merciful. The Great Hall of the Galactic Council was a marvel of xenological architecture, a sprawling amphitheater suspended in the upper atmosphere of Prime, the capital world. Its walls were crafted from translucent silicates, refracting the pale light of a dying binary star into a kaleidoscope of muted colors. It was designed to instill awe. To Ambassador Thomas Wright, it just felt like a very expensive cage. Wright stood at the center of the deliberation floor, his dark suit a stark contrast to the shimmering robes and bioluminescent carapaces of the surrounding delegates. He gripped the edges of the obsidian podium, his knuckles white, fighting to keep his expression entirely neutral. Above him, elevated on a floating dais, sat High Counselor Valen of the Valerian hegemony. The Valerians were a tall, avian reptilian species who had dominated the galactic military-industrial complex for millennia. They relied on plasma lances, hard light projectors, and thermal beam emitters, elegant, clean, and in their eyes, civilized. Humanity, by contrast, threw rocks. Very fast, very heavy rocks. Ambassador Wright, Valen's voice echoed through the translation matrix, smooth and dripping with condescension. The vote has been ratified by a majority of 73 to 12. The Ordinance of Civilized Conflict is now galactic law. Wright leaned into the microphone. High Counselor, with all due respect, this ordinance is not about civilized conflict. It is a targeted disarmament of the United Nations Navy. You are outlawing the fundamental basis of our defensive capabilities. The ordinance was deceptively simple. The acceleration of solid, liquid, or gaseous mass through chemical, electromagnetic, or gravitational means for the purpose of kinetic impact is strictly forbidden in all recognized sectors. It is a ban on barbarism, Ambassador, Valen countered, a ripple of agreement shifting through the alien delegates. Your railguns and mass drivers rely on primitive, unguided destruction. They leave orbital debris. They cause collateral damage. They puncture hulls and vent atmosphere, subjecting sentient beings to the vacuum of space. It is cruel, unpredictable, and frankly, primitive. We are merely elevating you to the standards of the modern galaxy. Wright ground his teeth. It was a perfectly executed political trap. The Valerians knew that humanity's shielding technology was centuries behind the galactic standard. We couldn't build plasma weapons that matched theirs because we couldn't build the thermal dampeners required to keep our own ships from melting when we fired them. Our entire survival in a hostile galaxy relied on our mastery of metallurgy and electromagnetism. We used depleted uranium slugs, tungsten carbide penetrators, and magnetically accelerated hypervelocity missiles. A Valerian plasma beam might scorch the paint off a human destroyer, but a 100-kilo tungsten slug moving at 3% the speed of light would crack a Valerian dreadnought in half like a dry twig. They didn't want to civilize us. They wanted to invade our border colonies, and they needed our teeth pulled first. If we comply with this, Wright said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register that made the translation matrix hum, you leave our border worlds entirely defenseless against pirate factions and undocumented marauders. The Council fleet will provide adequate protection, Valen lied smoothly. You have 6 Earth Standard months to dismantle your kinetic arrays and retrofit your vessels with regulated energy emitters. Failure to comply will result in an immediate embargo, blockade, and military intervention by the Valerian Grand Fleet. Wright looked around the vast, shimmering hall. He saw the smug satisfaction in the eyes of the Valerians, the indifferent blinking of the aquatic Trelka, the nervous, averted gazes of humanity's few allies. They actually thought they had won. They thought humanity's reliance on ballistics was a technological limitation. They didn't understand that for humanity, the kinetic weapons were the compromise. 6 months, Wright said, straightening his posture, his voice echoing cleanly through the massive chamber. The United Nations of Earth will comply with the Ordinance of Civilized Conflict. We will dismantle every railgun, coilgun, and mass driver in our fleet. Valen blinked, his nictitating membranes flashing in surprise. He hadn't expected the humans to fold so quickly. Excellent. We look forward to your compliance demonstration at the Sigma 9 Proving Grounds. Wright picked up his datapad, slipping it into his breast pocket. Be careful what you wish for, High Counselor. You are stripping away the rules of engagement we set for ourselves. You are taking away our chains, not our weapons. Without waiting for a dismissal, Wright turned and walked out of the Great Hall. The heavy silicate doors sealed behind him with a resonant thud. He tapped his comms earpiece, opening a direct, heavily encrypted, quantum-entangled line to Earth. "Get me General Miller," Wright said, his voice icy. "Tell him the Council just signed their own death warrant. It's time to open the Black Vault." The Pentagon's Sublevel 8 was a place that officially did not exist. Buried 300 feet beneath Washington, D.C., shielded by yards of reinforced concrete, lead, and Faraday cages, it was immune to both nuclear strikes and orbital surveillance. The air smelled of ozone, stale coffee, and the unique nervous sweat of stressed engineers. General David Miller stood at the head of a massive holographic tactical table, his arms crossed. He was a man carved from granite, with a chest full of ribbons from the First Centaurian skirmishes. Surrounding him were the brightest, most terrifying minds Earth had to offer. "Let me get this straight," Miller growled, looking around the room. "The Xenos want us to fight a war without bullets. No missiles, no slugs, no shrapnel." Dr. Evelyn Reed, the lead physicist for DARPA's Advanced Weapon Systems, pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "That is the exact wording of the treaty, General. The acceleration of solid, liquid, or gaseous mass. They've outlawed the physical transfer of kinetic energy." To her left sat Thomas Peterson, the CEO of Lockheed Martin Space Division, tapping a sleek titanium pen against his tablet. Beside him were top-tier contractors from Raytheon Technologies and Northrop Grumman. This was the dark heart of the military-industrial complex, summoned together under an emergency wartime mandate. "So, what do we have?" Miller asked, leaning over the table. "They want energy weapons, lasers, plasma. Can we retrofit the fleet in 6 months with something that can punch through a Volarian deflector shield?" Peterson sighed, shaking his head. "No. Volarian shields are specifically designed to disperse localized thermal energy. A standard plasma lance or high-intensity laser just splashes against their shields like water against a windshield. To build a laser powerful enough to overwhelm their thermal dissipation, the power generator would be the size of a small moon. That's why we stuck to kinetic penetrators. A tungsten rod moving at 0.03 C doesn't care about thermal dispersion. It relies on raw, brute force momentum to shatter the shield matrix." "Then we're dead in the water," Miller said bluntly. "Not exactly," Dr. Reed chimed in, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous, almost predatory light. She tapped a few commands into her console, and the holographic table shifted. The schematic of a standard human destroyer faded away, replaced by something entirely different. It looked like a massive cylindrical cannon, but there was no barrel, only a series of complex, interlocking magnetic rings, leading to a bulbous, heavily shielded reactor. "When humanity first stepped out into the stars," Reed began, her voice steady, "we encountered species that had been spacefaring for millennia. We knew we were outgunned. So, DARPA initiated Project Shiva. It was a contingency plan, a weapon of last resort." Peterson's eyes widened, recognizing the file name. Evelyn. Project Shiva was shut down. The UN Security Council classified it as a crime against nature. "It was shut down," Reed corrected, "because it violated the Geneva Conventions, the Outer Space Treaty, and basic human morality. But the Galactic Council doesn't adhere to Geneva, and they just explicitly banned our moral alternative." "Explain," Miller ordered. "Volarian shields operate on a specific frequency to block heat, light, and kinetic force," Reed said, manipulating the hologram to show an alien dreadnought. "But they don't block fundamental subatomic radiation, because space is already full of it. They just filter it. If they blocked all radiation, their sensors wouldn't work. They'd be flying blind." She zoomed in on the weapon schematic. Project Shiva is not a laser. It is a directed phase-shifted gamma ray and neutron cascade projector. Specifically, it utilizes a stabilized microsingularity, a localized Hawking radiation engine, to fire a concentrated beam of high-velocity neutrons and gamma radiation. "A radiation beam?" Miller frowned. "Like an X-ray laser? We tested those in the 1980s. They aren't powerful enough." "Not just radiation, General," Reed said, her voice dropping. "A Dirac pulse. Have you ever heard of a neutron bomb?" "Of course. Cold War relic. High radiation, low blast radius. Kills the troops, leaves the infrastructure intact. Nasty stuff. Exactly, Reed nodded. Now imagine a localized, directed neutron pulse operating at an energy level 1 billion times higher, focused into a beam the width of a dinner plate, traveling at the speed of light. It has zero mass. It is not kinetic. It produces no thermal impact on the hull. She pressed a button, and the hologram simulated the weapon firing at the alien dreadnought. A silent, invisible beam struck the ship. The Valerian shields flared briefly, then ignored it, classifying the beam as a burst of cosmic background radiation. The hull of the ship remained perfectly intact, not a scratch. "I don't get it," Miller said. "It didn't do anything." "Look inside," Reed said softly. The hologram shifted to an internal view of the ship. "The beam passes effortlessly through shields and armor," Reed explained, her tone chillingly clinical. "But the moment it interacts with organic tissue, water, or highly complex molecular structures like the coolant in their reactors or the blood in their veins, it induces spontaneous atomic decay. It disrupts the strong nuclear force. Every atom of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen in the beam's path is violently ripped apart at the subatomic level." The table was dead silent. The holographic crew inside the alien ship simply dissolved, turning into a glowing radioactive slurry, then into fine atomic dust within a microsecond. "It doesn't just kill the crew," Peterson whispered, staring at the simulation in horror. "It boils their DNA. It turns them into soup. And the radiation cascade immediately destabilizes the control rods in their plasma reactors," Reed added. "Without the crew to run emergency venting, the reactor goes critical and melts down from the inside out. There is no explosion from our weapon. We break no hulls. We throw no mass. We merely shine a very specific, very deadly light on them." General Miller stared at the glowing blue ghost of the dreadnought. He was a soldier. He was used to the clean, brutal arithmetic of kinetic warfare. You hit the enemy hard, you blow their ship up, they die. Fast. Combat. What Dr. Reed was proposing wasn't combat. It was a localized extermination event. It was a radiological nightmare that humanity had collectively agreed to lock in a dark box centuries ago. "Is it legal under the new treaty?" Miller asked, his voice barely a rasp. "Perfectly," Reed said, pulling up the text of the Council's ordinance. "No mass is accelerated, no kinetic impact occurs. It relies entirely on quantum destabilization and directed Hawking radiation. Under the laws of the Galactic Council, this is technically considered an energy illumination device. It's the equivalent of a flashlight." Peterson took a deep breath. "If Lockheed and Raytheon pivot all manufacturing, if we use the dark money budgets, we can retrofit the entire heavy cruiser fleet in 4 months. But General, if we do this, there is no going back. The galaxy thinks we're primitive because we use bullets. If we show them this, they will view us as monsters." Miller looked up from the table, his eyes hard and cold. He thought of the border colonies, of billions of defenseless humans living under the shadow of the Valerian fleet. He thought of Ambassador Wright standing alone in a room of aliens who wanted to see Earth brought to its knees. "They wanted us to put down the stones," Miller said. "Let's show them what happens when humanity decides to stop playing nice." He slammed his fist onto the table, shattering the hologram. "Authorize Project Shiva. Build it. Let's give them their demonstration." Sector 4 of the Galactic Council's territory was a barren, lifeless expanse of deep space known as the Sigma-9 Proving Grounds. Normally used for testing new shield harmonizers or plasma yields, today it was a theater of geopolitical dominance. Fleet Admiral Jonathan Hayes stood on the bridge of the UNS Nimitz, humanity's premier supercarrier. Around him, the cold, sterile lights of the bridge illuminated a crew that worked in tense, hushed efficiency. The air was thick with anticipation. Floating just off the starboard bow, shielded behind 3 layers of hard light barriers, was the Council Observation Station. Inside, hundreds of alien delegates, including High Counselor Valen, were watching, sipping synthetic nectars, waiting for the humans to humiliate themselves. To ensure fairness, the Council had provided the target, a decommissioned Goliath-class dreadnought. It was a massive, jagged mountain of titanium alloy, roughly the size of Manhattan. Its shields were fully powered, calibrated to maximum density. Standing near the back of the Nimitz bridge, arms folded behind his back, was Valerian Commander Kalen. He had been sent as an official observer to ensure the humans didn't cheat. Kalen's avian eyes darted around the bridge, an amused smirk playing across his beak. Admiral Hayes, Kalen chirped, his translator adjusting the pitch of his voice to sound smooth and diplomatic. The High Counselor sends his regards. He notes that your ship lacks the traditional mass driver barrels. Have you successfully installed plasma emitters? Hayes didn't turn around. He kept his eyes locked on the primary viewport, staring at the Goliath dreadnought floating 10,000 kilometers away. Something like that, Commander, Hayes replied smoothly. Excellent, Kalen purred. You may commence your firing sequence whenever ready. The target's shields are active. Do not be discouraged if your new energy weapons fail to penetrate on the first attempt. Adapting to civilized warfare takes time. Hayes' jaw tightened. Understood. He turned to his tactical officer, a young lieutenant whose hands were trembling slightly over the firing console. Lieutenant, Hayes said, his voice calm, projecting absolute authority. Spin up the Shiva array. Target the center mass of the dreadnought. Aye, sir. Core warming. Magnetic containment is at 100%. Singularity stable. Routing Hawking radiation into the primary focal lens. A deep, sub-audible hum vibrated through the deck plates of the Nimitz. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It felt like the very fabric of space around the ship was shivering. The lights on the bridge flickered once, drawing a curious glance from Commander Kalen. Energy spike detected in your forward hull, Kalen noted, looking at his datapad. Curious. It's not plasma. Are you attempting a rudimentary laser strike? Target locked, Admiral, the tactical officer announced, ignoring the alien. Hayes took a deep breath. Humanity was about to cross a threshold. For centuries, they had thrown mass. They had broken hulls. Now, they were going to do the unthinkable. Fire. There was no thunderous roar. There was no blinding flash of light. No spectacular beam of neon plasma tearing across the void. In the vacuum of space, the Dirac pulse was entirely invisible to the naked eye. From the outside, it looked as though the Nimitz had done absolutely nothing. For a full 3 seconds, silence reigned on the bridge. Commander Kalen let out a short, clicking laugh. Admiral, I believe your weapon has misfired. The Goliath's shields register a 0.0 impact rating. Your energy weapon barely tickled its navigational sensors. Give it a moment, Commander, Hayes said softly, his eyes fixed on the telemetry screens. On the observation station, High Counselor Valen was already drafting a speech about humanity's failure, preparing to issue the order for the Valerian fleet to move on the outer human colonies. But then, the dreadnought's telemetry began to scream. Wait, Kalen said, his smirk vanishing as his datapad lit up with hundreds of critical error warnings. What is happening? The Goliath's internal sensors are failing. The life support matrix is offline. The Goliath dreadnought hung motionless in the void. Its hull was perfectly intact. Its deflector shields were still glowing a healthy, robust blue. But inside, absolute hell had been unleashed. The directed phase-shifted radiation beam had passed through the shields as easily as light through glass. In a fraction of a nanosecond, it swept through the 5,000 biomimetic test dummies positioned inside the ship, designed to simulate a living crew. The dummies, made of organic equivalent hydrogels to test life support, instantly boiled. The strong nuclear force holding their complex molecules together ceased to exist. They dissolved into a highly radioactive, glowing green sludge, and then vaporized into gas, coating the interior bulkheads in a fine, irradiated film. But the radiation didn't stop there. It hit the Goliath's primary coolant reserves. The water instantly separated into hydrogen and oxygen, expanding at 1,000 times its volume, creating localized pressure bombs that blew out the interior corridors. Finally, the beam hit the plasma reactor's control rods. The exotic alloys meant to stabilize the core degraded into useless isotopes. Admiral! Kalen shouted, his feathers puffing up in panic. The dreadnought's core is in uncontrolled meltdown. The emergency venting systems aren't responding. The automated crew analogs. They're gone. Their signatures are completely gone. What did you do? We illuminated them, Commander, Hayes said coldly. In the viewport, the Goliath dreadnought finally reacted. Because the hull was perfectly intact, the pressure from the melting reactor had nowhere to go. The massive ship began to bulge, the tritanium alloy groaning and stretching under impossible internal heat. The blue deflector shields flickered wildly, and then a star was born. The dreadnought's reactor breached. Because there were no kinetic holes in the ship to vent the blast, The explosion compounded upon itself, turning the entire vessel into a contained fusion bomb. In a flash of blinding white light that forced the Nimitz's viewport auto-tints to engage, the Goliath dreadnought vanished. There was no debris left, no chunks of metal, just a rapidly expanding sphere of superheated plasma and irradiated dust. The shockwave hit the Nimitz, rattling the heavy cruiser, while the observation station's shields flared violently to deflect the sheer output of thermal energy. Dead silence fell over the bridge once more. Commander Kalen's datapad slipped from his talons, clattering onto the deck. He stared out the viewport, his eyes wide with a terror no Valerian had ever known. He looked at Admiral Hayes, his beak trembling. You didn't break the hull," Kalen whispered, his voice cracking. "You bypassed the shields entirely. You turned the crew into radiation. That is a biological atrocity. It is an abomination." Hayes turned slowly, his eyes locking onto the trembling alien. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. "You banned kinetic weapons, Commander. You banned breaking the hull. You told us that physical impact was barbaric." Hayes stepped closer, towering over the Valerian. For 300 years, humanity fought with railguns and tungsten slugs because it was precise. It killed the ship, but it gave the crew a chance to evacuate. It was warfare with rules. Hayes pointed out the viewport at the swirling cloud of atomic ash. "We didn't want to build this. We knew the physics, but we kept it locked away because we considered it a crime against existence. But you forced our hand. You took away our clean war." Hayes's voice was a low, terrifying rumble. "Go back to your High Counselor, Kalen. Tell him the United Nations Navy is now fully compliant with the Ordinance of Civilized Conflict. And tell him that if a single Valerian ship crosses into human territory, we won't throw rocks at them anymore. We will simply erase them." The footage of the Goliath dreadnought dissolving into a miniature sun played on an endless, terrifying loop in the center of the Great Hall on Prime. The once proud Galactic Council chamber was in a state of absolute, unmitigated pandemonium. The iridescent robes of the delegates were ruffled. Their bioluminescence flashed in erratic, chaotic patterns, indicative of deep biological panic. The aquatic Trelka delegates were furiously bubbling in their containment suits, while the insectoid Vesk clicked their mandibles in a deafening cacophony of distress. High Counselor Valen stood at his floating podium, his feathers completely flattened against his body, a physiological response to extreme predatory threat. He slammed his ceremonial gavel against the obsidian console, the sound cracking like a whip over the terrified murmurs. "Order! This council will come to order!" Valen screeched, his translator matrix struggling to modulate the sheer panic in his voice. The hall slowly quieted, though the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. "The human demonstration at the Sigma, 9 Proving Grounds, is a clear and flagrant violation of galactic law," Valen declared, pointing a trembling talon at the hologram of the expanding plasma cloud. "This Shiva array is a weapon of mass biological destruction. It targets organic tissue, it induces atomic decay, it is a war crime, and the United Nations of Earth must be sanctioned, blockaded, and their leadership detained." "On what grounds, High Counselor?" The voice was calm, human, and devastatingly loud. The heavy silicate doors of the Great Hall parted, and Ambassador Thomas Wright walked in. He wasn't wearing the standard diplomatic tuxedo today. He wore the stark charcoal gray uniform of a United Nations naval attaché, flanked by 2 towering human marines in full ceremonial dress. Wright walked down the central aisle, his footsteps echoing in the massive chamber. He didn't look like a man whose species was about to be sanctioned. He looked like a man who owned the building. "Ambassador Wright," Valen hissed, his nictitating membranes flashing furiously. "You have immense audacity returning here. Your fleet has unleashed a radiological nightmare. We banned kinetic weapons to prevent cruelty, and you respond by boiling a simulated crew alive." Wright reached the deliberation floor, calmly linking his datapad to the Council's central projection system. "High Counselor, I strongly suggest you choose your next words with the utmost legal precision," Wright said, his voice dropping the temperature in the room. "Because the United Nations of Earth recorded every syllable of the Ordinance of Civilized Conflict. Section 4, Paragraph 12. Let's read it together, shall we?" A massive wall of text appeared next to the burning dreadnought hologram. The ordinance specifically bans the acceleration of solid, liquid, or gaseous mass through chemical, electromagnetic, or gravitational means for the purpose of kinetic impact. Wright paced slowly in front of the alien delegations. It further defines acceptable weaponry as devices relying on the transmission of thermal, electromagnetic, or quantum state energy, colloquially understood as directed energy weapons. Wright stopped and looked up at Valen. The Shiva array accelerates zero mass. It creates zero kinetic impact. It utilizes directed Hawking radiation and quantum destabilization. By the exact, stringent, and non-negotiable legal definitions drafted by the Valerian hegemony and ratified by this very council, the Shiva array is a completely legal, standard-issue energy weapon. It turns blood into radioactive gas, a Trelka delegate screamed through his aquatic translator. It is a biological agent. It is a beam of light, Wright countered smoothly, locking eyes with the Trelka. What that light does when it interacts with your biology is a matter of basic physics, not chemical warfare. If a Valerian plasma lance melts a human skin off, it is not classified as a biological weapon. It is thermal damage. Our weapon induces subatomic decay. The fact that your bodies and your reactor coolants are highly susceptible to it is a tragic biological vulnerability. It is not a legal violation. The chamber fell dead silent. The aliens were trapped in the very bureaucratic cage they had built to imprison humanity. You did this intentionally, Valen whispered, the realization dawning on him. The humans hadn't scrambled to comply. They had weaponized the treaty itself. Let's talk about intention, Wright said, his tone shifting from diplomatic to predatory. We know why you passed this ban, Valen. Earth intelligence intercepted the Valerian Grand Fleet's deployment orders 3 weeks ago. You weren't trying to civilize us. You were trying to disarm our border defenses so your fleet could annex the Orion Spur without taking heavy casualties from our mass drivers. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Several delegations turned their gaze to Valen, who suddenly looked very small on his floating dais. You thought we were primitive, Wright continued, his voice echoing cleanly. You thought because we used depleted uranium and tungsten, we were ignorant of higher physics. But DARPA, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman didn't ignore radiation warfare. We mastered it a century ago. We just chose not to use it because, unlike the Valerian hegemony, humanity possesses a conscience. Wright tapped his datapad again. The hologram shifted, showing a massive web of logistical shipping lanes. The demonstration at Sigma 9 was just the prototype. Wright lied effortlessly. The bluff was necessary. As of 0800 hours this morning, General Dynamics and BAE Systems have mass-produced the Shiva array. Our entire 7th Fleet has been retrofitted. But more importantly, our Skunk Works division has patented the only known countermeasure, high-density, biomimetic lead-bismuth shielding matrices. Valen's eyes widened. Shielding? Yes, Wright smiled, a cold, terrifying expression. Your standard thermal shields actually make the Shiva pulse worse. Your shields trap the radiation inside your hulls, cooking you faster. The only way to survive a Dirac pulse is with our proprietary shielding. Wright leaned against the obsidian podium. And seeing as the galaxy is now a much more dangerous place, the United Nations is willing to lease this shielding technology to any council world that formally recognizes human sovereignty over the Orion Spur and permanently denounces the Valerian hegemony's military monopoly. It was a masterstroke of geopolitical extortion. Earth hadn't just checkmated the Valerians militarily, they had just hijacked the entire galactic defense economy. Valen's beak clattered in blind rage. This is a coup! This is blackmail! The Valerian Grand Fleet will not be held hostage by apes. He slammed his fist down on the communication array. Admiral Taylock, execute contingency Epsilon. Target the human homeworld. Let us see how your Shiva array handles a synchronized orbital bombardment of 10,000 plasma dreadnoughts. Wright didn't flinch. He just shook his head. I told General Miller you'd be a sore loser. The space above the capital world of Prime violently distorted as a massive slipspace rupture tore open the vacuum. For 1,000 years, the Valerian Grand Fleet had been the undisputed masters of the stars. 10,000 sleek silver warships, bristling with thermal emitters and hard light shields, hung in geostationary orbit. They were a force of pure, elegant destruction, moving in perfect, synchronized formation. Admiral Taylok, a veteran of 100 campaigns, stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Sunbreaker. When the order came from High Counselor Valen, he felt a surge of pride. Finally, an excuse to wipe the arrogant humans from the galactic map. "Spin up the plasma lances," Taylok ordered, his voice echoing across the fleet's tactical net. "Set coordinates for the Sol system. We will burn their blue world to a cinder." But before the Sunbreaker could align its navigational drives, a second, infinitely more violent slipspace rupture tore the fabric of space just outside Prime's gravity well. It wasn't a sleek alien dreadnought that emerged. It was the UNS Nimitz, followed by the entirety of the United Nations 7th Fleet. Human ships were not elegant. They were brutal, utilitarian slabs of heavy armor, built like floating anvils. They were dark, jagged, and heavily scarred from years of asteroid impacts and pirate skirmishes. But today, their massive, empty mass driver barrels had been replaced by the bulbous, glowing rings of the Shiva arrays. "Admiral Taylok." A voice crackled over the open, unencrypted galactic comms. It was Fleet Admiral Jonathan Hayes. "This is the United Nations Navy. You are ordered to power down your weapons and stand by for boarding. Failure to comply will result in your immediate illumination." Taylok sneered. "A bold bluff, human. You have 50 ships. I have 10,000. Even if your cursed radiation weapon destroys my flagship, the rest of my fleet will turn your primitive metal boxes into slag. All ships, lock plasma lances on the human fleet. Fire at will." Space erupted into a blinding grid of neon blue thermal energy. Thousands of high-yield plasma beams lashed out across the void, striking the human ships. On the bridge of the Nimitz, the alarms blared, but Admiral Hayes stood perfectly still. "Ablative armor holding, sir," the tactical officer reported, sweat beading on his forehead. "The new heat sinks from Lockheed are doing their job. Outer hull temperature is critical, but internal bulkheads are stable. We can only take this for about 4 minutes." "That's 3 minutes more than we need," Hayes replied. "They think we only brought a sniper rifle. Let's show them a shotgun. Lieutenant, link the fleet's targeting computers. Wide dispersion pattern. Dial the Shiva reactors down to 4% yield. I want a non-lethal, sustained burst. 4% I. Linking fleet arrays. Wide beam aperture set. Fire." 50 human warships engaged their Shiva arrays simultaneously. Because it was dialed down to 4%, the Dirac pulse wasn't strong enough to instantly dissolve complex organic molecules. It wasn't going to turn the Valerian crews to glowing sludge. But it was more than enough to achieve DARPA's secondary objective. The invisible wave of phased gamma and neutron radiation washed over the 10,000 ships of the Valerian Grand Fleet. It passed through their thermal shields as if they didn't exist. Aboard the Sunbreaker, Admiral Taylok watched in horror as his bridge consoles sparked and died. "Report!" Taylok screamed, the emergency red lighting kicking on as the primary power grid failed. "Admiral!" the chief engineer choked out, coughing violently. "The reactor, the control rods have completely degraded into inert lead. The plasma core is dead. Secondary backups are failing." The radiation swept right through the ship. "What about weapons?" "Offline. Navigational thrusters. Offline. Life support is running on auxiliary batteries. We have maybe 2 hours of breathable air." The engineer looked up, his eyes bloodshot, a mild nosebleed starting to run down his beak. "Sir, the crew is experiencing nausea, dizziness, and spontaneous hemorrhaging. Acute radiation sickness. We're dead in the water." Across the orbit of Prime, the pride of the Valerian hegemony went completely dark. 10,000 ships, rendered entirely useless in a matter of seconds. No hulls were broken, no ships exploded. It was a silent, bloodless decapitation of the largest military force in the galaxy. On the bridge of the Nimitz, Hayes watched the telemetry screens turn gray as the alien energy signatures vanished one by one. "Enemy fleet is completely disabled, Admiral," the tactical officer breathed out, awe and terror mixed in his voice. "They are adrift. Open a channel to the surface," Hayes commanded. "Patch me through to the Great Hall." A moment later, the terrified face of High Counselor Valen appeared on the main screen. He looked up at the sky, knowing his invincible fleet had just been swatted like insects. High Counselor, Hayes said, his voice completely devoid of triumph, carrying only the heavy, exhausted weight of a soldier who had done what was necessary. Your fleet is currently drifting in orbit. Their reactors are dead. Their crews are suffering from mild, non-lethal radiation poisoning. If you dispatch medical shuttles now, they will survive. Valen opened his beak, but no words came out. You called us barbarians, Hayes continued. You tried to force us into a corner, hoping we would expose our throats. But humanity learned a long time ago that true power isn't about how big of an explosion you can make. It's about control. We used kinetic weapons because they gave our enemies a chance to surrender. They were a courtesy. Hayes leaned closer to the screen. The courtesy is gone. Earth is now the sole proprietor of radiation warfare defense. We will be drafting a new treaty. You will sign it. And you will never, ever dictate the terms of our survival to us again. Hayes, out. The communication cut. Down in the Great Hall, Ambassador Thomas Wright adjusted the cuffs of his uniform. The alien delegates around him were absolutely silent. Some were trembling. The Volarian hegemony was over. A new apex predator had just claimed the galaxy, and they hadn't fired a single bullet to do it. Wright picked up his datapad, gave a polite, chilling nod to the stunned delegates, and walked out of the hall. He tapped his comms earpiece. General Miller? It's Wright. You can tell Lockheed to start shipping the biomimetic shields. We've got a lot of new customers. Humanity had been forced to put down its stones. In return, they had brought the darkness. Humanity proved that true terror isn't found in the boom of a cannon, but in the silent, invisible light of survival. When pushed to the edge, we didn't just rewrite the rules of war, we monopolized them. Did this sci-fi HFY drama keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved this deep dive into galactic politics, corporate strategy, and human ingenuity, hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe for more epic HFY tales.
Hi, my name is Tran Trong, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video Galactic Council banned all kinetic weapons, Earth responded by showing them something much worse _HFY, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What I enjoyed most about this story was the tension between control and creativity. The Galactic Council believed they could limit humanity by banning one kind of weapon, but humans adapted in ways nobody expected. That's one of the things HFY stories do really well, showing how determination and problem solving can become more powerful than rules or restrictions. I also think the story quietly reminds us that people often find new paths when they're pushed into a corner. Sometimes trying to control others too tightly creates consequences no one sees coming. Do you think the Council underestimated human nature from the start? And what moment made you realise Earth's response was going to change everything? Thanks for spending time with Palace Truths today. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment and maybe like or subscribe for more HFY sci-fi stories like this.